Well, welcome back. As we continue our program. So all of our speakers are multifaceted and speaking to many dimensions of the problem. You may notice a loose outline of the progression today, even though each speaker is speaking at all three levels. We're looking at excavating the past to understand the power structures and divisions of the present. We're looking at the structures in the present and the biases in the present that continue to constrain our options. And then finally, we're looking at organizing for the future. So as I said, each one of our speakers has in some ways addressed all three levels. And now we turn to Richard L. Wood to speak about organizing and imagining going forward. So Rich Wood is a professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico, as well as the founding director of the Southwest Institute on Religion and Civil Society. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley and holds an MA in degree in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. In addition to his teaching, Wood's scholarly expertise focuses on the cultural and institutional bases of democratic life, especially those linked to faith communities. His early work studied congregation-based community organizing in low-income neighborhoods of the United States, culminating in Faith in Action in 2002, which received the 2003 award for Outstanding Book in the Sociology of Religion from the American Sociological Association. His 2015 book, A Shared Future, Faith-Based Organizing for Racial Equity and Ethical Democracy, analyzes work for racial justice within a national multiracial organization and how that organization negotiates the tension between multiculturalist and universalistic democratic traditions. It received the 2016 Arnova Award for Best Book in the Study of the Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector. Rich's current projects include finishing Faith in the Fire of Public Life, a book on the future of public religion in the United States, Uncertain Democratic Future. Dr. Wood's presentation is entitled Faith-Based Community Organizing for a Multiracial Society and Ethical Democracy. Responding will be Chuck Mingo, a teaching pastor at Crossroads Church and the founder and CEO of Living Undivided and Working Undivided, a program that takes participants through life-changing moments of racial healing. His desire is to activate people not only to participate in acts of mercy and reconciliation, but also to challenge systems of oppression and injustice. In addition to Leading Undivided, Chuck teaches and consults for churches and organizations around the country on a variety of topics related to race, relations, and racial justice. Part of his life's work is to help ministry leaders stand in places where people view the church as irrelevant regarding injustice and offer skeptics a different picture of Jesus. Pastor Mingo will be responding along with a group of other religious leaders from Dayton, whom he will introduce in turn. So let's welcome Dr. Rich Wood.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, te invitamos. That's the Dene word. Good afternoon. Coming from New Mexico, I just want to draw your attention to the land acknowledgement that's in the program for Native ancestors in the region. Thank you very much, Vince, for that introduction, and also to Kelly Johnson and Lori Elo for their great work putting all this together. I also want to thank Professor Corey Edwards and Professor Maureen O'Connell for their earlier keynotes, and all of you here. And it's traditional to use a form like this to flog my own book, which I only did subtly by putting an image up in front of me before I start. I actually don't want to do that today. I want to flog their books. The book up here is, it's been 7 years since I wrote it. I actually think it's a flawed book. I want you to buy Corey Edwards' book and Maureen O'Connell's book. They are both really fabulous, important documents for our moment in Catholic America and America more broadly. But before I start, I especially want to recognize the work of Brother Ray Fitz here, but also all of the communities in Greater Dayton that strive and continue to strive to overcome the legacies and ongoing realities of institutionalized racism, of sin in this community and in this nation. I'm really honored to be here, share this lecture with all the speakers and with Reverend Chuck Mingo and Pastor Renard Allen, who are going to speak in response. By the way, there's nothing worse than sitting and listening to somebody talk when they don't speak loudly enough to actually hear. And I'm getting to be at that age in life where I can't hear things all the time. So if I don't speak loudly enough, just do this or yell at me or something. I'll try to pick up my voice. Before, I'm actually going to do this as a kind of formal talk, but before I start, I always want to connect to some of the things that have gone on this weekend as well. First, the theme of, I think, raised originally by Brother Ray fits in 2 decades of, no more like 4 decades of work here, about the focus of his work on, I think he described it as organizing networks of action in our region. And what I'm going to do with most of the talk today is really talk about what that looks like on the ground. What organizing those kinds of networks for action, how we can do that most effectively. But I also want to connect with some of the ideas presented this weekend around the notion of solidarity, what I believe it was Maureen O'Connell who spoke of the virtue of social justice. But then to think together, as she said, what is it that we're doing when we actually live out the virtue of social justice? That's a pretty abstract, solidarity is a pretty abstract notion. What is it we do? And that was talked about as its work to change the institutions and the systems to better serve the common good. When you actually live the virtue of solidarity and social justice, solidarity identified by John Paul II as well as Francis. John Paul II wrote about it as the key virtue for the modern world, along with faith, hope, and love. And the virtue of social justice, as articulated by Raymond Fitz, is to change institutions and systems to better serve the common good. And what I want to suggest in my talk today is, I think probably everybody in this room has dedicated time and part of their lives to that. But I think part of what we're learning is that requires deeper work than any of us had known we needed to do up until recent years. That really doing that requires a kind of deep work in which we must change. It's not just changing the world, but we must change, especially for white Americans, that we must change in pretty significant ways in order to be able to do that work in full collaboration with brothers and sisters. I'm going to talk about that both as cultural change and institutional change. And I'm going to talk about it partly as getting beyond niceness, the American gospel of niceness. That really what Jesus wants you to do is to be really nice to everybody. Mm-hmm. And that's just not the gospel. And that the work today requires a much deeper kind of discipline of social change than that whole idea of niceness that lets us get to. And then finally, I do want to say that my beloved friend, Corey Edwards, who I only know through professional connections, and much of what I'm going to say is going to link up very closely with everything that Professor Edwards had to say. But I'm going to give you a little different take on a couple things. One is I'm going to emphasize multiracial spaces as a really important space right now. Not because I disagree with anything that Dr. Edwards says, but because I think those spaces are so important, we've got to get them right. And especially white Americans have to learn to get them right. I'm going to emphasize that because I think Dr. Edwards is exactly right about how distorted those spaces often are by whiteness and white normativity now. And I'm also going to give you a little bit of a different view of faith-based community organizing. One reason for that, no doubt, is that I now serve on the board of one of the big national networks, and so I'm probably biased, so just know that. And the organization that I work most closely with is now deeply committed to racial justice at the center of what they do. And is now a Black-led organization. The executive director, the deputy director, the national director of organizing. It's truly a Black-led organization in very important ways. And that's shifted the organization in some ways that matter for the conversation today. But lastly, I think I'm going to give a little bit of a different view because Dr. Edwards was speaking of sort of the current reality generally of organizing in Ohio. I'm going to try to draw on to what I see as the best practices of organizing. So don't take everything I'm going to say as this is what organizing is. At its best, I'm going to try to articulate what organizing really looks like in those kind of multiracial spaces. So in doing that, I'm going to do sort of a long introduction, to get some ideas on the table, mostly organized around the idea of ethical democracy. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of the paper talking about the practices that can begin to embody ethical democracy and true multiracial collaboration in our own work as we go forward. And I'm going to do that in about 25 minutes, I think, and then we'll have some time, some responses, and some time for some conversation. So I'm extraordinarily grateful to be here today, to think with all of you about some of the current urgent issues of our time. Let me first tell you what I will not address, at least not directly, despite their urgency. For one, the urgency of the moment encompasses the vast economic insecurity of families, the desperate struggles of working class folks of all races seeking to find work that allows a dignified life, as the wealthy make a killing in this new American economy. Our urgency encompasses also the deep fears and insecurity of middle class folks, knowing they may be one illness or one lost job or one divorce away from economic ruin. It encompasses the sheer pain of poor folks as their neighborhoods and schools have declined, and as labor unions, long the best promise of upward mobility for poor folks in America, have been gutted. And for those of us blessed with that rare thing, stable and rewarding careers, the urgency embraces a certain kind of uneasiness, I think. Perhaps an unfocused guilt, or at least a vague awareness that something's not right in the land, that we have failed to set things right despite our good intentions. And yes, those urgent issues very much include racism and racial inequality, the ongoing grind of America's original sin into our modern world and our 21st century society. Too often, people who look like me see past that ongoing reality until a George Floyd or a Breonna Taylor, or perhaps more locally, a John Crawford or Clifford Owensby shows up on our screen or on our news feeds. And then we express this surprise horror that such things can happen still. Though others among us today know that reality all too well, have to face its potential reemergence every day as they or their kids or their grandkids enter that world. Our urgent moment also embraces immigrants and the unfair impact of the pandemic on service workers and on the elderly. It embraces the struggle of women to support families on wages far lower than men doing similar work, and all that many struggles we face as a society. If we are to be honest, if we really want to transcend those urgent realities, we must recognize them, name them, and as I will later argue, talk about them directly with honesty and compassion. But here today, I propose to think with all of you not about those particular current realities, but rather think forward into the future, our future work, not as an escape, but rather in a way that's grounded in honesty about inequality and racism and the rest. I do not have easy answers to any of those matters, would not insult you by suggesting easy answers. But what I want to speak with you about is what I am confident of, that we as a nation and in our communities, we will only successfully address all those issues to the extent we build the democracy we need. A truly multiracial and interfaith democracy that can carry America into the future while reflecting who Americans actually are today. Without pretending to know exactly what that future will look like, let's give a name to it, a name to that future multiracial and interfaith society that provides decent career opportunities for everyone. In my writing, I've called such a future, quote, ethical democracy. So let's use that term as a signal, to signal a form of shared life that embodies full equality for all Americans, heals the wounds of racism and economic injustice and devastated neighborhoods and devastated lives that has been our recent reality. Let me note, ethical democracy cannot be just a matter of elections and office holders. Right now, those things provide a veneer of democracy without much of the substance of real equality. And even that veneer is at risk right now as we speak. We should be proud that this country finally removed most of the openly racialized legal barriers to equal electoral participation. But some are busily working to reconstruct those barriers out of their fear of the new American majority. Such a veneer of democracy, one always at risk of erosion, simply isn't enough. Ethical democracy must be about our deep culture, our institutions. That is what I would like to address today. Ethical democracy and how we can get there concretely. We must build a culture of everyday life in which people come together across racial and ethnic lines, learn new insights and new skills from each other, and mutually enrich our lives. By this, I do not mean to invoke the usual kind of paper-thin multiculturalism that relativizes everything and thus avoids the hard reality that some things work better than others and some things help human beings thrive more. Such thin multiculturalism, I think, only reinforces the kind of lasting power of the status quo, of a kind of white normativity that's no longer acceptable. We need more disciplined thinking than that, clearer choices. In contrast to that, I think a robustly multicultural society can draw the best principles and practices from a wide variety of diverse cultural streams, talk about the hard reality that choices have to be made, and then work together respectfully across racial identities to implement the best ideas and the best cultural models, all in the service of a better future. Of course, those choices cannot just be made by the people who've led us to where we are today. We cannot continue a society in which elite leadership slots are mysteriously nearly always occupied by groups who've been privileged historically, groups who look like me. That's still true today. The best data we have shows that upwards of 85% of the memberships on the boards of directors, both in the corporate sector and in the nonprofit sector, are occupied by white people. 85% white in 2022, mostly men, and especially true in corporate America. So we must build institutions with deep multiculturalism at the heart of their organizational cultures, in which institutional leadership is exerted by widely representative leaders with real leadership skills, the kinds of skills that young people are developing today in ways that my generation just never did. That's not always popular, but to say this clearly, to work towards it diligently is neither racist nor reversed racism. It is simply to name a real historical pattern, while insisting that all groups have leadership skills that can benefit our institutions. Working together toward that goal is to help make us all who we aspire to be as more broad-minded Americans. But I do think we can't force people into that kind of diversity, all into one box. So we must build institutions and cultures while allowing divergent communities to foster and develop their own local cultures with real autonomy. The argument here isn't that we all need to become a kind of amalgam of cultures. We'll probably preserve distinct cultures in our own settings in various ways, but build a truly shared multiracial culture for our common work. That's a tall order, but you will hear today about some current efforts that are doing so successfully, some signs of hope in troubling times. I do want to just say a bit about religious diversity as well. In offering the term ethical democracy for what I think we seek, what at least the better angels of our nature deserve, I mean something much more than a political society in which different flavors of Christians can feel comfortable, with some sprinkling of Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus spread around, just enough to avoid upsetting the comfort zone. Interfaith democracy must accommodate various flavors of Christianity, to be sure, and those other traditions as well. But it must also welcome the most radically secular and the tiniest spiritual minorities into the fold, in what the political theologian Luke Bretherton has called the politics of a common life. That is, those different groups may define a different common good, but can engage in a politics of the common life of shared dialogue across their differences. Such an interfaith stance embraces the shared search for meaning across these human communities, but also appreciates, and in fact is curious about the differences embedded in those traditions, and treats them as resources for building a better future. And as a final point in this long first section, notice that I say we must build ethical democracy. And by build, I mean to signal two things. First, that ethical democracy is a shared construction project in which all of us have important roles to play over many years, certainly for the remainder of this man's life. Let's call it a 20-year project. Succeeding will require the best of many people, many of us drawing on the fullest skill sets of every American community. That shared project to build ethical democracy can unite us in ways that no sort of hyper-politicized blaming will ever get us to do, whether that comes from the right or the left. And I think it's the most radical building project of all. Second, by building ethical democracy, I signal a future orientation. There can be no return to some supposedly more democratic past, maybe pre some recent public figures, in which people were nice to each other. No such past democracy, real democracy, existed. We can be rightly proud of the best features and aspirations of American democracy that are so much admired around the world. But we must also acknowledge that our democracy has, from its inception, also been poisoned by its exclusions, its compromises with racist evil, and its commitment to colonialism against native peoples, and finally, to maximize profits at any cost. Those are more hard realities to name, but honesty about them can keep us from falling into nostalgia for the past. Instead, we will, quote, build new cultural and institutional foundations that can sustain the kind of ethical democracy that we need. Okay, that's been a long introduction, and it's not quite done. Hold on to just one thing from all that. The image of a truly multiracial, truly interfaith, truly egalitarian democracy as a kind of future horizon that can pull this nation together and offer something to the world that we can all be proud of. Ethical democracy beckons from the horizon if we can just find the heart and the will and the spirit to build it. But we also need concrete skills to get there. That's actually what I'm here to talk about today. The kind of skills we need for such a shared project and how we can acquire them. More precisely, or at least more sociologically, here's the question I want to ask. What practices, that is concrete ways of doing things, what practices can foster a future we can all share by shaping the kind of culture and institutions that are capable of undergirding ethical democracy? I spent 3 decades researching and writing about a set of organizations nationally, you've heard a bit about today already, with roots in local communities that offer some real insight into what kinds of practices or skills we need and how we can get them. Those organizations are today honing those practices and increasingly putting them at the service of what I call ethical democracy. They go by various names, so I'll group them as faith-based community organizing efforts. Their work has been funded for decades by the Catholic bishops through your donations to the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. In Ohio, this work goes by names like Amos in Cincinnati, or Bread in Columbus, or the Mahoning Valley Organizing Collaborative in Youngstown, or LEAD here in Dayton, and parts of the work of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative around the state. I want to tell you about a broad set of practices that these folks teach and embody, and that any of us can learn. Some of you already practice. The 2 most central practices are what I will call relational organizing and a shared commitment to values. One of those comes from secular democratic roots, secular democratic and Republican, small d, small r roots. That is, secular democratic, this country's deep commitment historically to equality, secular, small r Republican, this country's commitment to structures that hold power accountable to people. I don't mean the political parties by those names. And the other comes from religious roots. If there's one core practice at the heart of faith-based organizing's promise for constructing ethical democracy, it is relational organizing. What does that mean? Relational organizing is a way of doing politics, politics in the best sense, as the ancient Greeks first understood it. The work of shaping our future together via public discussion and electing people to represent us. Relational organizing links people together by building ties, real ties, substantial ties, friendship, between them by investing time in those relationships. Then it plugs those people into representative democracy in order to change the future. The origins of relational organizing lie in the early movement for women's right to vote, in the 20th century labor movement, including the work of A. Philip Randolph, and in Jane Addams' urban resettlement houses, in the civil rights movement, and some of that systematized by Saul Alinsky, a secular Jew, who also observed how organized crime in Chicago in the 1940s used relational organizing for less noble purposes. Nice to know. In relational organizing, you actually get to know other people who share your concerns, including people not like you, in some significant way, different politics, different experiences in life, different social backgrounds due to poverty or privilege or race or immigration, or education. People who are really different in those ways often share concerns about the conditions of life in our cities, about the crisis of meaning in our suburbs, about rural poverty, about the substance abuse crisis in all those places, and the devastation it brings, about corporate behavior and laws that allow elites to capture vast wealth while the quality of life of working and middle-class folks erodes, and while the opportunities for young people emerging from places like the University of Dayton erode. Their different backgrounds may lead them to see different solutions to those common concerns, but the concerns are often shared, and relational organizing allows them to talk to one another, see their common concerns, and hash out together what might be the best solutions. We call that deliberation. Once you know someone a bit through that kind of work, it's much easier to deliberate with them, to think together and find solutions, rather than just talk against them to defend your own ideas, or have them talk against you in defense of their ideas. That means you, sitting down in person, one-on-one with somebody you do not know, somebody not like you. It means really learning their story, what they care deeply about, what experiences have made them who they are, what makes them angry. That cuts against the grain of our chit-chat culture with its easy familiarity. Too easy familiarity, in that you really can have coffee or a meal with someone, or maybe attend church with them for a decade or two, without ever having that kind of real conversation, without ever really knowing them. The goal is not private intimacy, a private friendship with other people like you, but rather public friendship with a person unlike you in some important way. It's countercultural and makes some people uncomfortable, especially if you do not help them understand it as you invite them into that kind of relationship. But done well, such relational organizing can also be the basis for forming deeper bonds of trust and friendship than most people now have in their lives, especially friendships across racial or economic lines. Sounds a little old school. Some think it's too old school, too old-fashioned, doomed by a new age of digital organizing, and that younger generations raised on social media are sort of incapable of real social ties. I have no doubt there are real challenges there, exacerbated by the pandemic-induced isolation. But I work with young people from diverse backgrounds every day. They're as capable of real social ties as anyone. Relational organizing can teach them how to do that systematically, and with an eye on moving our society towards a fully ethical, multiracial democracy. Yeah, they'll use the digital tools better than we do in their work in that regard, to extend relational organizing to wider social networks more efficiently. But let's not relegate young people to virtual lives, relationless lives. Let's trust in young people's capacity for deep relationality with an eye toward real social equality across races and religions and identities. Might not such work help us reknit the fabric of our society, torn so deeply and worn so thin by fear-driven politicians and now by pandemic isolation? That's relational organizing, tool number one in this project of building ethical democracy. Let's call tool number two a commitment to shared values. I think I'm going to do this kind of briefly. The whole notion of shared values is the language of values risks becoming this really abstract thing that doesn't get us anywhere. But it also provides a kind of accountability. If you can get somebody to talk to you about their values, about the principles that they try to live by, it gives you some entree to hold them accountable to those principles, help them reflect on how they can more fully live out those principles. I just do, in this piece of the paper, it'll be available to you, just talk about the usefulness of that kind of accountability. And the language of values helps us hold one another accountable. So what I've said so far, for a project to construct a truly ethical democracy that at least the better angels of our nature deserve, we need three things. We need first deliberative spaces. We need to build deliberative spaces where we think together about our lives and what kind of society we really want. Second, those deliberative spaces need to include ongoing interactions. They can't be one-off, that deepen our trust and sense of a shared future that we can all thrive in. And third, we need to bridge the divides among us with courage, whether those divides are racialized or based on differing urban, suburban, rural realities, or based on differing religions or worldviews or experiences. Building bridges takes people with courage and a sense of the Spirit among us. If we can find that courage, how are we then to act? That is, I'm not inviting you to a change of heart. I don't know your hearts. I trust you all have much, much good in your heart. Rather, if we're to redeem the promise of equality for all, the promise of real democracy, we each need to begin to act in new ways. Here are a few of the practices, the ways of acting in the world in our day-to-day work that faith-based organizing sees as mattering most. First, to the extent you want to really change society for the better, you have to be willing to act politically. That does not have to mean becoming a partisan attack dog. Partisan attacks are really good for mobilizing people to do things like go out and vote for your party. But the deep challenges before us demand organizing rather than mobilizing. What's the difference? Mobilizing thinks in the short term and tries to get folks who agree with you to get out to vote or to turn out for an event. Organizing thinks in the long term. It forges networks of people who do not agree on everything, but share a commitment to build the future. And organizing seeks to weave those networks of the different kinds of people into an organization that continues forward, that can shape a community for years, adapting to new challenges, not just one issue, adapting to new challenges, new issues as they emerge, while keeping an eye on the goal of ethical democracy. Second, none of this is a project that any of us should impose on the wider community. The very term is my own, not one used widely anywhere I know of. Rather, ethical democracy, by whatever name you want to use, will emerge from the practice of real small d democratic, small r Republican conversations from the bottom up that flow into the political world via our expectations for a different kind of politics, a different kind of politician to govern us. It will emerge from a politics that rewards politicians worthy of that vision from any political party and punishes those politicians who are too puny or too self-centered or too corrupt for our vision as a people. Only a politics built on real grassroots conversations can sustain that kind of politics. Third, let's not be Pollyannish or naive about the conversations that can undergird relational organizing. We might bring the best of intentions. We might be really willing to get beyond ourselves via those kind of one-to-one meetings. But when we do reach out to people from other backgrounds, there are always issues of inequality and power and privilege that come into play. The best professional organizers I know, across race, across different kinds of organizations, have learned to recognize and be honest about those inequalities, about that power, about their own privilege. And whether they come from the upper or the lower side of those differentials of race or income or education or gender, they make a theme of it. They thematize that difference and reflect on it and how we can build a more equal relationship. They make a practice of naming any awkwardness or alienation in the room and managing it jointly in dialogue with input from everybody. That makes for hard conversations about hard topics, about anti-Blackness and white privilege, but also about the way that shaming in pursuit of racial equity shuts down dialogue, about sexism and gender inequality, but also about the ways that working class white men as well have taken it on the chin in recent decades of rising inequality and the busting of labor unions, and a whole host of other hard themes. Where relational organizing has built up real trust and a real sense of shared struggle, such conversations really can happen. Indeed, some folks here know more about that than I do, including most prominently my co-presenters, Dr. Corey Edwards and Dr. Maureen O'Connell, and the respondents you'll hear from shortly, including Reverend Chuck Mingo and Pastor Renard Allen. In Chuck's case, his role as a founder of a really impressive interracial dialogue organization called Indivisible. A fourth practice. Good organizers invite people in those dialogues to step forward and step back. They invite all participants to think for themselves. If you're the kind of person, because of your personality, because of your social background, tends to shy away from the conversation, tends to be silenced or silent in the conversation, you're invited to step forward, to speak into the moment more assertively. Alternatively, if you're a person who, because of your personality, your social background, your privilege, tends to speak a lot or speak early in a group setting, then you're invited to step back, to allow space for others to step into the conversation and have some first say. Organizers do this in the belief that wider perspectives actually allow better decision-making, richer decision-making, more reflective thought about our current situation, and therefore better responses. And that's actually been really well documented in research out of Harvard in recent years. Organizers also do this in the belief that real equality requires special care to equalize interpersonal dynamics. It's not enough to assert equality. You have to actually equalize the dynamics in the room. In that way, they create free spaces that undercut privilege, actively seek to undercut privilege, while allowing everyone to participate fully. Fifth, in working with groups seeking to transcend racial and religious divides, good organizers have learned to expect discomfort and plan for conflict rather than fearing those things. More deeply, they've learned to push behind their own tendency to flee discomfort in such moments and instead embrace conflict as fertile. Let me say that again, embrace conflict as fertile, or at least potentially fertile if it's handled adroitly. There are lots of studies of workplace cultures and of family life that show how conflict can be a source of that kind of creativity. Some of you know that work. But I'd like to cite the scriptural and theological take on this by Mexican Catholic Jesuit Carlos Bravo Gallardo. In his book, Jesus, Hombre en Conflicto, Jesus, Man in Conflict, Bravo uses the Gospel of Mark, the first written gospel, the source of much of the Gospels, to argue that we only understand Jesus' ministry. We only understand the trajectory of his life and therefore the reasons for his death if we appreciate the kind of dramatic structure, the dramatic flow of the Gospel of Mark. Mark depicts Jesus' entire life and death as revolving around a series of moments when he enters into conflictive relationship with people in either political or religious authority, and in particular with the political, economic, and religious elites of his day. Jesus refuses time and again to free from those conflicts, instead entering fully into conflict in order to advance his core project, the preaching of the reign of God, the advancing of the common good in the language we've used this weekend. Bravo says Jesus is not the Jesus of the modern American gospel of niceness. Across much of the Catholic or liberal Protestant or conservative evangelical worlds, as well as in other faith traditions, we have baptized niceness as the good news. We have forgotten how Jesus actually lived the gospel in conflict with social elites when they fail in their responsibility to the community. Jesus does not sweetly suggest that maybe the Pharisees should more nicely administer the religious law. He denounces them as, "You whiten sepulchres." Jesus does not gently suggest that the money changers of the temple maybe should depart the patio of the temple. He drives them out with a lash and calls them the den of thieves. Jesus reserves his sweetness, his gentleness, his pastoral touch for repentant sinners and for those economically downtrodden or socially marginalized in his midst. So Jesus, man of conflict indeed. The practice of creative conflict with inflated elites lies at the heart of the very original gospel. By living into such an understanding, careful community organizers engage people's imaginations to begin to envision the society they want to live in, not simply to accept the society they've been dealt. Engages people's imagination, engages that kind of vision of a future horizon that they want to create. Such a step is crucial for young people. I'm looking at you, Renard. Such a step is crucial for young people emerging into adulthood today. If today's young adults accept the status quo that they've been dealt, embrace the social reality that they have had handed to them, they will live a future in which several specters loom large. For me, climate catastrophe, the assault on racial equality, the failure of real opportunity, real economic opportunity, they're some of the specters that loom largest. But pull up your own specters of the future. Do we want rising generations coming into adulthood to live that future, whatever you have in mind? If we cannot imagine a different future together, we will be condemned to live that one. Sixth, and critical to what makes interracial and interreligious solidarity work within faith-based organizing. The work of organizers is not primarily about talk. For all I've said about that kind of relational talk work, it's not primarily about talk. They do relational organizing, but it's not talk for its own sake, or even interracial relationships for their own sake. Rather, they constantly put into practice what I call the lived solidarity of shared projects in the world. That is, participants are working together, organizing together to make a difference in society and people's lives. As the great Pennsylvania organizer, Dwayne Royster, shout out to Dwayne Marine, likes to say, we are here because we want to change the damn world. To put it simply, moving from mutual talk to shared action in the world changes everything about our relationships. It brings new urgency, new accountability, new passion, new trust, that investing my time in this work might actually lead us somewhere. Theologically, for Catholics and other Christians in the room, we might say it parallels the move from just the Word of God as an abstraction to an understanding of incarnation, the very Word of God as a lived reality, the Word made flesh for the life of the world. And that makes all the difference. The lived solidarity of shared projects in the world is how the incarnation becomes most real and most relevant today. Organizers call this taking action. They form teams of people from a parish or from different neighborhoods, from a congregation or different suburbs. Then they offer them the authority. And it really is sort of, people aren't used to taking this authority, it's sort of offered to them by organizers to choose what concerns they want to address and burden them with taking the initiative to address those concerns. They teach them to do quote unquote research actions with elected leaders or legislative staff or some public policy expert to learn something about that issue and how to address it. And there's really great research by a guy named Paul Spear that shows that when leaders from almost any setting participate in research actions, they very rapidly develop in all new ways. They take new initiatives, they take new voice in meetings. Those research actions really, they learn something, but it forms them in new ways. It happens for leaders from working class communities, from the poorest neighborhoods, and from prosperous suburbs. It happens for women even more than for men. It happens for white, Black, Latino, Asian American, Native, and multiracial folks a lot. Lastly, as a practice, while research action shaped leaders, three other kinds of public action are how faith-based organizing mostly makes an impact in our world. It's how they change the damn world. All three of these involve standing together in public within those networks of relationships that have been built through relational organizing. But these three ways stand together in three different ways. I'll call them protest actions, political actions, and electoral actions. Protest actions involve standing against something, typically in demonstrations for issues, maybe against police brutality or mass incarceration, maybe against low wages or union busting, maybe against poor schools and inadequate public support programs. These days, most crucially, maybe in Ohio against voter suppression efforts, but they're all standing against. Political actions involve standing together, typically advocating for particular policies, particular solutions identified through research, and doing that in front of an elected representative or a corporate CEO. I've seen actions like that with 100 people in front of a school board member, and actions of 6,000 or 10,000 people in front of a governor or a senator. Always the organization proposes specific solutions to specific problems and asks for official support. Maybe that's higher wages, better policies, or more responsive decision-making for the needs of poor and middle-class communities. And then they hold those people accountable through the third category, electoral actions. Electoral actions strive to influence who represents us in City Hall or in the state capitol or in DC. And so they reshape the very ability of government to address our community's concerns. And today, maybe we should say the willingness of officials to address our concerns. Electoral actions involve educating voters and then getting out the vote. They unfold over months leading up to the vote. They require really deep investment of time and money and people's energy, and they can make a really large impact. But done poorly, they can also break organizations if their efforts fail or they get absorbed into partisan political structure. So the takeaway from that, embodied public action with a vision towards a shared future shapes leaders with the kind of powerful interracial relationships like nothing else I've seen, at least. Okay, enough from me. Under the rubric of building ethical democracy, I've tried to outline a shared project that's not a return to some idealized past, but a forward-leaning effort to construct cultural and institutional foundations for the kind of society we all deserve, whatever the or religious or other backgrounds we've come from. I've laid out what I think are the crucial ways we can build such a future, focused around relational organizing and shared values, often built in faith communities, that can bridge across our differences, but grounded in very concrete practices for gradually building a new culture, gradually renewing our institutions in ways that will make them both more democratic and more Republican in the best sense of those words. I've spoken of promising practices gleaned from the best organizing I know. I'm not going to walk through all those again. All of those can contribute to building a culture of ethical democracy for all God's children. Let us talk to one another well, but always with a commitment to acting together, whether through protest against injustice, political actions for positive solutions, or electoral actions to shape who governs us. Better yet, let us do all those things in turn, as indicated by what the ancient prophets of Israel called the signs of the times, which the Catholic Church has learned to talk about since Vatican II, reading the signs of the times and acting into the moment. That is how we will build the shared future of ethical democracy. I've spoken long. Let's move on to something more in the spirit of this talk and this weekend. Some actual dialogue about the world we live in and how we can build a better future. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rich, for what you shared. And just to give framing for what's going to happen next, when I got the invitation from Kelly at the request of Rich to give a response, I said, you know what I'd love to do is, as they say in politics, I'd like to return some of my time to the great gentlemen, in this case, who are pastors who are doing this work locally in Dayton. And so I just want to give a bit of a reflection, and then I want to invite up two incredible leaders in Dayton who are doing exactly what Rich just talked about. I love your description of the ethical democracy. And you said it was a form of shared life, equality, and healing. It makes me think of the beloved community that Dr. King often talked about. And I'm struck by how similar it is to what Jesus actually preached. Because Jesus preached a kingdom. He preached a shared life of healing. He preached a shared life of healing and power and love and justice. And so I'm struck by that because I would say one of the things that has happened often in my vein of faith is there's been a great emphasis on the invitation to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And thank God that I can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And yet Jesus preached a kingdom, which is about a shared life with Jesus Christ. Kingdom that's not just personal, doesn't just address the personal, but it addresses the systemic. It's not just about believism, but it is about action. And a kingdom that isn't just about holiness, but actually is about justice. And so I'm struck by that vision of an ethical democracy because I do believe that it's what Jesus taught. Now, one difference to point out is that Jesus did not preach a democracy. He preached a benevolent dictatorship, which means that when it comes to seeking justice, when it comes to righteousness and mercy, when it comes to what we're talking about, for us as followers of Jesus, we actually don't get a choice. This is a command. And so it's in that vein that I believe we need to have both formation and action as followers of Jesus on how do we then pursue this shared life. And that's exactly what you're talking about, Rich. And it's why we need those deliberative spaces. And it's why we need, as you said, an ongoing way to have interactions with people who are different from us. And it's why we need what I would call courage-building opportunities to take action. And that's the heart behind Living Undivided, the organization that I lead, where our mission is to unite and ignite people for racial justice. And we've done this work with over 10,000 people over the last 7 years in over 100 cities and towns. But I am really excited about how this work is taking shape in Dayton. Because in Dayton, there were already leaders doing that shared project that you talked about. And as Living Undivided has come into the Dayton community, it really is fueling and supporting what's already been here. So I'm going to invite two people up to talk about the shared project that's happening in Dayton. So I'm going to invite up Pastor Renard Allen, who is with us. He's the pastor of St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church on the west side of Dayton. So we can give him a hand as he comes. Pastor Caleb Ingram. Caleb Ingram leads an organization called Declare Dayton, which is I told Caleb he has the gift of bridge building and building relationships. He is an organizer, whether he calls himself that or not. And so I would love for the two of them to give some reflection on how this work, this shared work, is happening in Dayton. So, Pastor Allen.
Good afternoon, all. I'm very grateful to have been given this opportunity by my brother and fast becoming friend, Pastor Chuck, and to have been graced by the wisdom and insight and I dare say even vision of you, my professor friend. Upon hearing his remarks and the compatible response of Pastor Chuck, it occurred to me that Jesus worked via collaboration. Even in creation, everything God does, he does collaboratively. For those of us who subscribe to the notion of the Trinity, he said, let us make man. Let us make the world as is. Creation was a collaborative effort. Salvation itself, the work of the atonement, and all of the subsequent divine work of God among us, through us, within us, is also collaborative. For once, when Jesus hung on the cross, via that substitutionary death, he spoke to the Father so as to indicate that this was something that was, again, a collaborative effort. And therefore, whatever it is that we do in the way of making a significant difference in the world is always done in collaboration. When I hear and reflect upon the words that have been shared, I think that what Caleb and I have sought to embody in our work together here in Dayton reflects what I call the structure of collaboration that addresses the systemic ills of our society, of which racism is one of my chief concerns. It requires a collaborative awareness, collaborative transparency, collaborative intentionality, collaborative imagination, collaborative spirituality, and collaborative solidarity. None of these things are as effective as they could and should be when they are embodied in isolation. It is not until they are brought together across all of the superficial lines that we have made that God has ignored, that they can be maximally effective. To that end, I stand before you as one who, upon being affected by the incident that snuffed out the life of George Floyd, was impressed by the Holy Spirit to do something different beyond preaching to my congregation how we felt about it, what the Word of God says about it, but to actually reach out to the neighboring pastors and faith leaders in this city and surrounding areas to come together and collaboratively address the issue. I'm pleased to announce that as a result of that, I am a co-founder of Dayton Ministers United for Social Change, along with Pastor Pat Murray of the Living Word Church. And we have a network of approximately 30 pastors across denominational, gender, and of course, racial and economic lines that meet together monthly in what I call a clergy huddle. And we address and discuss tough topics, and we are simply about the business first of building relationships across lines. And we have not just allowed this, I have not just allowed us to let this be a backroom deal, but I've used my platform in St. Luke to welcome pastors of different gender, different denominations, and different races to share with my congregation on even what we all consider the highest holy day, Easter. Our sunrise service for the last 2 years has been marked by Pastor Murray and his predominantly Anglican congregation. worshiping with our predominantly African-American congregation on the west side of Dayton. Some white people didn't know they could be safe on the west side of Dayton, and let alone worship. And they have been able to tear down that false mental barrier in worship. Pastor Rachel Billups of Ginghamsburg has spoken at our church, a church that does not ordain and license historically women to preach, has followed my lead and heard that woman preach, a white woman at that. So we are not just about going into rooms and into conference spaces where the grassroots people are not able to access these high-level conversations, but we are bringing our relationships to the forefront of our work in our field. And I close with this and yield the floor to one of the most brilliant, promising kingdom connectors, I believe, in the world, and Caleb Ingram, with whom I'm privileged to share, and he will give you the specifics that I've reserved for him to announce. But I think we must be very intentional about sharing our sacred space for others to see the work that we are doing, or else we become in God's ears and in their ears, but sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. He did not give us all of this giftedness and brilliance to be reduced to brass, cymbals, and silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Allen. It really is so humbling to be here, and thank you, Dr. Wood, and also Pastor Chuck, for giving some language to the work that we've been pursuing. That relational organizing, as you were describing that, the ethical democracy, certainly the kingdom of God, it helped give me more of a construct to fit what I believe the Holy Spirit and God has just placed within our hearts to pursue. So just a really brief background. I grew up in New Hampshire, which later I have come to realize is actually the second most Caucasian state, just percentage-wise, 95%, so 19 out of 20. And the region of New Hampshire I grew up in was that or more. So I am, as a white male that grew up in New Hampshire, have been as ignorant as about anybody in the United States to matters of race and justice. So fast forward, end up in Ohio, and for the last 6 years or so, I've had the incredible honor of pursuing with most of my full-time ministry working hours, this effort of Churches United. It's been a growing journey since then, but I'm thankful even as long as 6 years ago, God gave me just enough of an inkling to realize, hey, if you are pursuing Churches United across Dayton, and you show up somewhere, let's just say an arena, and 95% of them are also Caucasian, then you didn't actually fulfill the mission that you say you're pursuing, because that's not the picture of the church or the community in the greater Dayton region. So 6 years ago, I was just beginning with that, saying, okay, so what do I do? Anybody I can call on my phone is pretty much also white. Where do I start? Just being honest. So it's been a journey, but really into the last 3 years, I have to admit, while I recognized our relationships and our engagement, and even when we're on platforms, should truly reflect the diverse nature of the communities we're in, I was still so ignorant to the realities of the different lives and experiences that my friends of color have lived, and things they've had to face, and how that affects school districts, and how that affects how you feel when you get pulled over by the police, and how that affects so many different things. Again, I'm saying just 3 years ago. So I'm so thankful for, at this point, dear brothers like Pastor Renard Allen, that we've been able to journey alongside us. So a few things that we are doing, and then there'll be more questions, and you can certainly clarify and articulate more. But as an overflow of the Dayton Ministers United for Social Change, that I've been able to support his leadership and Pastor Pat Murray's leadership, one of the things that has flowed out of that is an undivided cohort. As we were having these conversations, again, I'm embarrassed to say this, but this group of pastors that had worked together, and many of them for 6 to 10 to more years, some of the first time we've really had the hard conversations. Oh, so that's a reality for Black Americans in Dayton specifically. What does that mean for us as churches? Yes, let's preach the gospel together. Again, coming from an evangelical background, that concept was pretty familiar to us. How do we know we should do something here, but what? What do we do? And so the undivided cohort has been one of the really practical parts of that journey, and helping this group of pastors and leaders really begin to dig deep in those honest and hard and necessary conversations, and also tying in historical background in those. Thank you, Dane, for leading us through those conversations here in the Dayton region as well. Out of that and what we've gleaned there are already a couple of things that are moving. Specifically, what does change look like? As we have now the shared understanding and relationship, this relational organizing, now we feel we have some responsibility to do something with that. And as we continue, again, we have our core belief in personal salvation, the kingdom of God, but in the community organizing, what does that look like? So Pastor Allen has already hosted a number of conversations with law enforcement. In the past, it would have been Chief Beal or Assistant Chief Carper, and the transition of Chief Absal. There's actually Meet the Chiefs event on April 28th that all of you would be more than invited to join, 6:30 p.m., remember correct, St. Luke's Missionary Baptist Church. But the power in that is it's not just Pastor Allen and St. Luke's inviting people to this meeting. It truly is this diverse group of clergy saying we're in this conversation together. So it's not only pastors of color who have directly experienced some of these things saying, hey, there's some problems we need to address. It's a group of us together, and some of us honestly saying, no, I've never felt that way when I got pulled over, but I have concerns that we're sharing together on the same platform because of our shared humanity for the common good. And to be honest, what has moved my heart, even more than the statistics, is hearing dear friends share their experiences and say that is no longer acceptable. And I should have been moved long before that, but at least in my journey, that's been a part of it. And we're also beginning conversations about how do we address the inequality around school districts. And there's not easy answers. You can look at in the booklet right there, right? You can see the economic differences from Beaver Creek to Dayton City Schools, the ethnic differences there. What can we do? And we believe there is something, as this conversation is currently moving with the community coordinator that's on staff. Actually, a pretty cool story. Angela, incredible woman of color that had just been raising her hand and saying, hey, there's problems. We need to look at this, we need to address this. One, I think, glimmer of hope is Dr. Lawley, Caucasian woman who's a superintendent of schools, said, okay, I'm going to hire you. You're on staff. What do we need to do? And so she's using that voice to engage a number of clergy and leaders that we've been able to be a part of. So that's still underway, but we're excited to see where that goes. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Was being quite modest. He also, with his organization Declare, which is a unifying and connecting organization, gathered along with me, Dayton Ministers United for Social Change, and People Far Beyond, and led a prayer march in the fall of 2021 that strategically had us stop at various locations in our downtown area, the school district, the courthouse, the prison, and to offer prayer collectively as community to end with the rally at Levitt Pavilion that addressed and acknowledged and affirmed our ongoing commitment to deal substantively with the systematic ills and the institutional sins of society. And so I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that very critical moment that united us across so many of those superficial lines. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And so we can take some time with all four of you here gathered for some questions and answers.
Yeah, let's together. Is this going to work on film? Or
Maybe over there.
Yeah.
Alongside the podium. Thank you.
please, questions, reactions, reflections, contestations, anything. Sir.
With Caleb, what's your last name?
Ingram. That was easy. We can go.
We're not contesting that.
And what was the name of the organization? Dayton United Ministers?
DMUSC, Dayton Ministers United for Social Change.
All right, had a couple easy questions now. Here comes the killer. Yeah, I'm just kidding. Well, I wanted to actually ask you all, first of all, I really found this a wonderful set of presentations that enriches and deepens our discussion today. So thank you very much. I love the organizing versus mobilizing distinction, particularly. And that this whole idea of relational organizing for ethical democracy. I want to ask any or all of you to reflect a little bit more explicitly on capitalism. Here's why. Dr. Wood, when you articulated
Please, Rich is
when you
fine.
articulated the three big challenges: climate change, racism, and I think the way the third one was the failure of opportunities. But what I read that as, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, sort of economic inequality, the failure of space, of real equality, equal opportunity economy. Yeah. All three of those, I believe firmly myself. I don't know if everybody sees it that way, but I don't know if I'd say capitalism caused them, but they are foundationally produced through capitalism. Racial capitalism depends on racism. That's why it exists. Slavery was an economic system. You know, climate change is driven by capitalism's persistence and perpetual growth, and the way that that's embedded in the system and the structures of it. Failure of opportunities and rising inequality is embedded in the interests of the wealthy class and allowing for greater and greater concentration of wealth in their hands. And they are willing to set policies that deny opportunity to the rest of people so they can do that. And this is my analysis, right? So when I heard you say those 3 points, I heard capitalism, I saw capitalism. And so in this process of relational organizing, how can, as people come to terms with a collective understanding of our reality and a collective shared vision of the future, I guess 2 questions. A, at what point in that process does capitalism explicitly become part of that discussion? Who name it and see it? And I'm sure that's dependent on situation. And then the second is kind of how can relational organizing in this grassroots movement be successful within a broader context where, especially in the United States, there's so much influence of wealthy elites and their interest in the political system, and that has only gotten greater, I feel, in the 21st century. So, yeah, please help me understand this.
A third easy question. Wow. Man, yes. So great question. It's the $95 question for our time in an important way. Let me just suggest, in the same way that we've been talking about the insidious ways in which racism colonizes our minds and our culture and our whole sense of self, but that's equally true of the way that certain form of capitalism it so deeply shapes who we are that we don't even know it's there most of the time. What Gramsci wrote about is the deep hegemony of that form of political economy. So yes, the struggle, and the phrase you use, racialized capitalism, if you haven't read some of the recent stuff on racial capitalism, the argument is our economy in this country has been structured by race in ways we've begun to understand about our culture, but the whole economy is racialized from the bottom to top all through our history. I do, however, want to distinguish our current form of capitalism in its racialized form and in its hyper unequal forms captured by elite interests in its own name, from what I would want to call a market-based economy. That I don't think the solution is anti-capitalist in the sense of destroying market economies in the name of some more man. That's been tried historically and has led to other deep problems, right? Can we build a market economy that the early free market economists, Adam Smith and company, talked about? Yes, markets that really solve any poverty. China's turn to capitalist markets has removed probably 400 million people from severe poverty, right? Markets do work magic in a certain way. But for Adam Smith, they have to be markets disciplined by moral systems. This is deep Catholic social teaching too. Disciplined by moral systems, most of them religious, and held to account by political structures that aren't captured by the capitalists. We have both religious systems and a political system captured by hypercapitalism. And what we need to do is re-empower the religious traditions and retake government of the people, by the people, for the people, but in a much more sophisticated way. And what I'm arguing today is not a return to the past, but the construction of new culture, new institutions that can actually pull off. Now that's only the beginning of an answer. Your question requires another conference and probably our 20-year project, but that's the 20-year project.
Well, I was just going to say ethical capitalism is, you're talking about ethical democracy. Ethical capitalism, I think, is part of this issue that we're talking about. But it's very difficult because money shapes so many things. It shapes our political system. It shapes, in our case of our Catholic Church, I think it shapes a lot of that. So I think it's something we really need to look at.
In my classes, I use a graphic, a kind of idealized image of a community standing on pillars, legs of a table, and those pillars being, political system, economics. But Jürgen Habermas, the great German sociologist, diagnoses our current moment, not in racial terms at all, but as the hyper growth of the economic system and the political system, the economic critique being a left critique, the political critique actually often being a critique of communism, right? Communism as a hypertrophied state government structure. But they've both become these massive structures that have turned around and now colonized our systems, colonized our communities, colonized our neighborhoods, and act exploitively, extract not just resources, but our whole identities. Think of the social media empires. They extract our whole identity into a profit-making enterprise. And how do we turn that around? That's, I think, the challenge of our time. Sir.
Yes, Rich, you said that we need not to return to the past, but we need to build a new future, a new culture. But you've also said that we should look to the religious traditions. Out of what do we just construct this new culture? I mean, it can't just come out of the air. Where do we find solid values? What is the relationship between that future and things from the past?
Others have thoughts on that?
I think that we have to, I like how he put, I actually appreciated his inclusion of referencing the religious traditions in the cultivation of a new culture. I think the postmodern American experiment with an anti-religious government is part of our great problem. So I think that there has to be a recognition of the value and wisdom in all faith traditions that seek expression in this democracy, and somehow finding that river of life in which the wisdom from all traditions flow, and tapping into that and making that a part of the foundation for what we build. There were some tornadoes that ravaged our communities, and one of the marvels is that where homes that were literally devastated, totally, I could see through them kitchens where bathrooms were bedrooms were, some homes where you could not see anything but debris, where there was once total devastation, there now stands new, beautiful homes on the same foundation. So I think that having religious values allows America to continue to have that as a part of our foundation while still constructing a new house, so to speak, in which we can reside in harmony and equality and without the sort of social atrocities that divide us that we've acknowledged. So for me, and being incredibly biased as a pastor, but hopefully not overly biased as a Christian pastor, the wisdom in Hinduism, the wisdom in Buddhism, the wisdom in Islam, the wisdom in other faith traditions must be considered. And I have a growing concern that we don't become anti-religious as a nation to the point that we become religiously intolerant, but that we rather consult a variety of those religions, look for the common wisdom, and make that a part of the core of whatever we do. A valueless society is as dangerous as a visionless society.
Can I speak that briefly? So two things come to mind that are related to that, but may go around it as well. First, I completely agree in this 20-year journey of building this new ethical democracy together, that it will rely calling back into some of these faith structures and the values that have been there. So I agree with that, and identify that I think will be very challenging, because just as, say, the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, God instructed them, don't take on all of the practices and the idols and some of the things in the cultures around you. I think many traditions within the American church have taken on a lot of those cultural things we're talking about within the American dream system. Some of those which aren't bad, but some of those which are. And when those things become married to a point that it's hard to distinguish what are those truly true and beautiful things that are the kingdom of God, and where have we become so aligned with a particular bipartisan approach. So I think it's absolutely true and will be difficult to distinguish at times, to mine the value from there without polluting it with the other things we've associated with it. Second, I think just as much as we have in our work built relationships across religion in this region, one thing I think we need to recognize, just to call this out, I'm so humbled and honored that I'm this close to Brother Ray Fritz right now. my friend Tim Beat at St. Mary's Development, do you know Brother Ray? You need to meet. So I would love to talk to you afterwards.
Watch out for bites.
But why I highlight this is, at least from my perspective in this region and beyond, oftentimes we have pretty close circles of the Catholic Church community and Protestant church community. Even within that, right, there's subsets of evangelical and mainline, etc. I think for us to do this work that we're talking about, that 20-year journey to be successful, and for us as the Christian church, I believe Protestant, Catholic, all, to bring those values to the table. I might still be trying to figure out what to do with those other books of the Bible, but I think we can do this work together, right? I think there's a shared mission that we're on.
Say it.
Is it George? Am I remembering your name? Dennis, sorry. I just want to pay honor to the radicalness of your question, because I think it's true. All of our structures, all of our traditions have also been colonized by the worst, most obviously in this weekend. In American culture, white supremacy has penetrated everything. The absolute commitment to profits above all else penetrates every layer of this society, so that we can't just kind of blindly turn to tradition for an answer. Habermas himself was absolutely radically secular in his original writings. In the last 15 years, he's totally rethought that, because what Caleb said I think is right. A political project premised on kind of starting from square zero, creating a new culture. I mean, cults have tried that time and again and failed. I think the historical lesson is you have to build off of deep currents that run. I love your image of a river of life that runs through all our traditions that we can tap into. But we have to be suspicious of them too. And I think that's why it's absolutely central that there not just be Black, brown, and Native people in the room and Asian American people in the room, but that we learn to defer and follow their leadership in a lot of stuff. The insight from Catholic social teaching is the view's better from below. You see reality more clearly from below. And my brothers here will see things that I miss because of the whiteness of my formation in America. And we have to learn not to lose our voices, not to just follow, but we all have a voice, we all have real power to bring to this. But we've got to learn to listen to people from a different vantage point.
Hello. So we rarely get an opportunity, I guess, as congregants or parishioners, however you want to call us, to kind of peel back behind the mysterious Wizard of Oz curtain. And so when you mentioned, I forget who said it, but you mentioned the clergy huddle, right? So I was just wondering if you would be willing to share some things that have emerged in terms of surprises around the huddle, and then also areas of challenge or growth around the clergy hub? Would you be willing to share?
What goes on?
So let me clarify, you're asking if he's willing to break the huddle.
Well, remember, the purpose of the huddle is actually to make sure we're all on the same page so we can run the right play. So there's no secret once we're running the right play. So some of the plays that come out of the huddle and some of the challenges in the huddle are first of all, relationship building. That's a big factor. You would be surprised to know the extent to which not only Black pastors and white pastors don't really build authentic, genuine relationships, but Catholics and Protestants don't, and Baptists and Methodists don't, and Episcopals who are Black feel isolated because we're Black Baptists. Black people are mostly Baptists, Methodists, Pentecostal, until you realize we're not. That there are Black Catholics and Black Episcopals. So the one thing that it does, one goal that we continue to realize more and more, is just getting us to talk to each other. That we are actually in conversation. We start off our huddle with an icebreaker where we just ask 3 or 4 from different denominations. What have they been reflecting on with their congregations? Your Bible study series that you're walking your congregation through? Is there a sermon series you're walking your congregation through? Is there any sermon that you have shared, lesson you have taught that has resonated with your people that you've received an unusual response from? If so, what are they saying? What impact has it had? So really kind of being what I call constructively nosy. About each other's work and what that looks like. One of the challenges that we have discovered along the way, however, is when we talk about conversations that relate to the grassroots realities of systemic matters. We run into what I call potholes of tension. And we don't run from that moment. We embrace that tension. There was a point in which we're huddling together, and a pandemic that started out being something we were all united around became politicized. And then you have pastors on there now who are part of the wave that went back into churches earlier than others, and others who saw that as a right-wing expression. And those of us that didn't go back in as leftists. So those tensions came to bear as we simply discussed and asked, what does reentry look like for your church? Why are you reentering now? So it brought out those tensions and brought out points of deep disagreement that is shaped subconsciously by a culture that we all inherited. And I'll close with this and let you all tease more out of everybody here. But one of the benefits of it is that we have the tough conversations, but we don't shy away from them, and we're committed to the relationship beyond the disagreement. So we never end with the disagreement sort of being the note of departure. We always make sure that we remain resolute to remain connected in spite of the sometimes very tense moments that we encounter. And as a result, again, for myself and Caleb in particular, this has not spread yet, and I desire to see it happen more. One of the tense things that I say in that setting that I would even say in here, because it's applicable at multiple levels in the academy and so forth, but in the church life, I said, people in white churches don't know what the gospel sounds like, feels like, looks like, because white pastors don't let Black preachers preach. I'm an intellectual, but I'm a pragmatist because Jesus was both. And, or if we preach, we're the token. And, if you go to a Catholic church, then there's this sense if you bring a Black Baptist, Well, how do I preach? Can I preach in the comfort of my tradition? Or can I not? But with Black people, I bring white people into our setting, and our whole field is be you. Don't holler if you don't holler at the Catholic church. Don't sing if you don't sing at your Presbyterian church. We are a diverse, dynamic people capable of understanding multiple expressions of the gospel. So you don't have to holler because we holler. You don't have to sing because we sing. Don't insult our intelligence. We are inviting you because our God is a diverse God. We believe in the concept of the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. The kingdom on earth as it is in heaven means that you have a diversity of presentation. What I want to see happen, and I think you all deserve to see happen, so you don't have to sit here and take our word for what goes on in the huddle, is on Easter Sunday, we should be cross-pollinating every pulpit in the Metro Dayton area, and the white people should be hearing the Black preacher holler about he got up early, and the Black people should be hearing the white people talk about the atonement and the substitutionary ramifications of our soteriology and how that impacts our sociology and how that affects our psychology and so forth and so on. But my point is, until we take this stuff from in here, and until we actually see, when you worship together, that makes us all common, that makes us all human, because I ain't worshiping you and you ain't worshiping me. We're worshiping something and someone greater. And until we can do that, then we really haven't broken down that wall. So you ask me what's wrong with us? We haven't climbed that wall yet, but we're working on it.
One minute, please. And this is mostly for my white brothers and sisters in the room, and folks of color, take it for whatever it's worth, because I don't know. I want to think about spiritual potholes, is that the phrase you use? In light of Maureen O'Connell's book, Untying the Knots. That image, untying the knots, comes from Pope Francis's spirituality. His favorite saint is this image of an Argentine saint. She's untying the knots. I think a lot of us white folks experience those potholes as this knot in the gut. The moment that our racism, the moment that we do something wrong, that like that knot in the gut that we can't perceive, and we abandon the space, we cry, whatever it is we do. Francis is dedicated to a Jesuit spirituality of discerning the spirits. And the core of Jesuit understanding of this is, if you are in your fundamental soul oriented towards God, to the holy, that the truth lands like a drop of water on a sponge. You absorb it, it's soft. But if you're fundamentally oriented away from the good, the holy, the drop of water, the truth, lands like on a rock and it's painful. I don't think we're all oriented away from the holy, but I think in our whiteness, most of us raised as I was raised, in our whiteness are fundamentally oriented away from the common good and the holy and what is beautiful in human life. And so that knot in the stomach is our spirit rebelling against how it's oriented. And we've got to do the work of untying the knots. We've got to find ways of filling those potholes on our own time through our own work, not burdening our friends with that, but learning how to do that work. I think that's why a conference like this is really great. It gives us resources for knowing how to do that. So thank you, sponsors.